Do y'all think of any questions on your break? All right. So we were talking about density independent, density dependent effects. Now we're going to focus on how do we model density dependent effects, essentially. All right. So, well, this happens every time. There we go. Now we should be back on track. All right. So we're going to look at three models, and they're just modifications of each other. They're just different ways of controlling density. For all of them, we're going to have the population size or population density down here at the bottom. And since this is population size represented as density, these would be numbers, and we'll have the carrying capacity marked along there. So that's essentially N. And then we're going to have two y-axes, and I've got one in red and one in green. And so the birth rate is in red, and the mortality rate is in green, and the lines will correspond to those two things. All right. And so the way that we're going to regulate density in the population is we are going to either allow the mortality rate to vary, the birth rate to vary, or both of them to vary. That's the three models in a nutshell. Okay. And so in this first one, you can see that we're going to hold the birth rate constant. So no matter what the population size is, whether we're below carrying capacity or above carrying capacity, doesn't matter, we're going to allow the birth rate to stay the same. But we need to be able to adjust the population size to accommodate for shortages in resources or abundances in resources. And so we're going to allow the mortality rate to vary depending on density. And so if we are below the carrying capacity, there's lots of resources, mortality will be low. If we are above the carrying capacity, then resources are limited, there's going to be competition for them, and the mortality is going to be higher. So you get more starvation, disease, and stuff like that. Right? So far so good? Coming back from our break? All right. And so along with just getting these lines on here properly for this particular model, where we hold birth rate constant and allow mortality to change with density, I want you to be able to label what R is, what the growth rate is at different points in the model. At this point right here, where the mortality and the birth rate are balanced, that means B minus D is 0. That means R is 0, right? Right here. So at carrying capacity, just at this one point in time, our birth rate and death rate are balanced, and our growth rate then is 0. Doesn't mean we don't have births and deaths, it's just that they're balanced. All right. In this piece of the pie, so we're not talking about everything on this side, just in this piece of the pie, this is what we're worried about. The birth rate is higher than the mortality. Birth rate is higher than mortality, and so our growth rate is going to be positive. We have more individuals being added to the population than being removed from the population in this triangle. On the other side of our carrying capacity, in this triangle, right here, our mortality is now higher than our birth rate. Our mortality is higher than our birth rate, and that means that our growth rate is going to be negative. And so what that means is anywhere you start on this graph, you will end up at 0, right? And so if I start with a population size that's right here, then the population is going to be growing. If I end up with a population size that's over here, that population is going to be decreasing. And so everything in this model is trying to get you to that 0. Okay. This side going up, this side coming down, 0. All right. We get that? Not too bad, right? Not too bad. All right. The second thing we can do then is allow the birth rate to change and hold mortality constant. So just the opposite of what we did on the previous slide. It's just a matter of remembering which line to keep constant. And so in this case, the mortality is the same no matter what the population size is. But in this case, the birth rate is going to decrease as the population density increases. And we do have examples of this in wild populations. Rats, some of the mice and rats will do this. When the population gets high, the males will release hormones that will suppress reproduction in the females. And so this is a legit thing. And not only that, when resources are scarce, it's hard for a female animal to become pregnant and to carry that pregnancy to term. So this is realistic in that regards. And so again, where our carrying capacity is, wherever it is on the x-axis, where these two lines cross, that's going to be at carrying capacity. Our growth rate is going to be 0. Our mortality and our birth are balanced. If we're below the carrying capacity, our birth rate is higher than mortality, and the growth rate is positive. And then if we go above the carrying capacity, now our mortality is higher than our birth rate. And so in this region, we're going to be negative. Okay? So the only difference between this one and the past one is what we held constant. And the next one is probably what's going to happen in many populations. And that is we're just going to let them both fluctuate. So you just get up with a big X. This is called full density dependent regulation, where both the mortality and the birth rate change according to the population size. So neither one is kept flat anymore. And so where the carrying capacity is, that's where your birth rate and mortality are balanced, and the growth rate right on this point is going to be 0. Now over here, the birth rate's higher than the mortality, so our growth rate is positive. And then on this side, the mortality is higher than our birth rate, and so our growth rate is negative. Thinking about our upcoming exam, if I asked you to draw one of these models, and all you've got is your pencil, what do you need to do to get all your points for that question? You need to label all your axes, right? I'm usually going to tell you to tell me what R is at different points in the graph. So that'll be part of the question. You need your R's on there. You need to label your carrying capacity. But what else do you need to make very clear to me?
Which line is which?
Which line is which? Yep. And you can do that with using a dashed line versus a solid line, those types of things. There are different ways to do it. You don't have to bring colored pencils to your exam to do it. But you do need to make clear which line is which. You can label one birth rate and label one mortality rate, but if you do an arrow and label them, you still need to make sure that you have your axis labeled. All right, everybody think you can do that? Okay.
Probably.
Probably. All right, let's talk a little bit about interest-specific competition. I've kind of thrown that term around quite a lot because that's what we've added to our model. I think you kind of know what it is. You seem to understand that if I threw the pizza in here and y'all were fighting over it, that's interest-specific competition. But one thing you need to understand is that interest-specific competition affects all the individuals involved. Okay, all the individuals involved. It is a negative relationship. We're going to eventually talk about mutualism and all that, but I'm sure you've been introduced to it in other classes as well. So that's the negative. Both individuals involved in the competition are harmed. And so to give you an example, let's say that we do the experiment and I bring a pizza in here and lock you in for a couple of days. There's a couple of things that could happen. One thing that could happen is you could all talk to each other extremely logically and politely and cut the pizza into, what do we have today? 10 equal pieces, and everybody gets their share. Or Brian could jump up on the table, grab the pizza, beat his chest like an orangutan, and say, "This is my pizza," right? In both of those situations, everybody's going to be negatively impacted. In the case where you share everything equally, that's not enough pizza for a couple of days, right? In the other one, when Brian jumps up on the table and says, "This is my pizza," what are you going to do to Brian?
Peter will kill them.
Wow, very aggressive. All right, and so that's what it's referring to. That's going to lead us into two types of interest-specific competition, and I just described both of them to you. Okay? We just have to put names on them now. The first type is scramble competition. Scramble competition, nobody gets enough of the resources. So this is where you, I doubt it's quite as polite as what I described, but you divide the pizza up and everybody gets a piece. Nobody gets enough. Nobody's really happy. That's going to be scramble competition. And the second type of competition is contest competition, where some individuals are dominant, they're going to monopolize the resources, other individuals are going to be subordinate, and they're not going to get any of the pizza. So who do you think really would be able to dominate? I'm just playing. Might even surprise you, you never know. Okay, so scramble competition, everybody gets some of the resources, but nobody gets enough. Contest competition, you have clear winners. That's where that name is coming from. So you have clear winners and clear losers, essentially. On the next slide, to help us think about this, I've made us a little graph, or chart, I guess, comparing scramble and contest competition. And so in scramble competition, everybody suffers. And I should be clear, everybody suffers if resources are in short supply, right? If we're below the carrying capacity and there's plenty of resources, this is fine, right? It just basically means you're not fighting over food, regardless of whether it's abundant or not. So this really only becomes a problem when you're over carrying capacity. Because of this type of interaction, which everybody's kind of suffering, the population size will tend to fluctuate wildly. And so if we think about our model, it's going to do more like big, huge loops like that. It's not going to be nice and flat. And sometimes you end up with stunted populations. So across from my house, my neighbors have a pond, and they don't want people messing with it too much. I have permission to go over there and fish it, but they don't do any type of management on it. And it's got largemouth bass in it, and that's it. And I don't even know what they're eating. I guess they're getting enough insects or enough frogs hop in there accidentally. But every time I go over there to fish, and I just do it for fun mostly, every single bass I catch is this big. They're like remarkably similar in size. I think what it is none of them get enough resources to get large enough, or they would eat each other. They're bass, right? They'd eat each other. Mm-hmm. And all of them have attained a size where they're too small to be eaten by each other. But every single one I pull out like this. I'm so tempted to just go catch some bluegill and throw them in there. But if you know anything about how bluegill populate a pond, they'd find out pretty quick. It wouldn't take very long until they became lots and lots of bluegills. But you'd also have some really big bass. Anyway, that can happen. When I was in grad school, I had a pond that if you didn't have bass in it, you just had bluegill. That's probably your more classic example. You get the stunted bluegill. They can be really old, but this big, that kind of thing. Overall, scramble competition wastes resources because you don't have those clear winners that are going to be able to survive and reproduce. Everybody's suffering, so nobody's getting enough to move through, right? We go through survive, grow, reproduce. There's not enough resources to go around. You might only be surviving and growing, but reproduction gets suppressed if you don't have enough resources, essentially. So that's what that's talking about. We'll hit wasted resources again when we talk about sexual reproduction. And then that's when the men in our class will take a hit, because we'll talk about the males in the population that don't reproduce are actually using resources that aren't going towards the next generation, essentially. So if you talk about lions, you have the lion and the pride, and then you have the ones that can't get a pride, right? That kind of thing. I know. We'll call it wasteful production of males, so just, emotionally support. Think about that.
Is it just towards, like, if they don't reproduce, or is it also, like, if they still end up dying, or, like, not being able to, like, get through winter or something like that?
It's just if you can't reproduce, right?
Okay.
Biologically, not socially, Thank goodness for me, right? I don't have any kids. But biologically, your success is measured by your contribution to the next generation. And so that's what that's measured. So when you have a population, like peacocks are a great example. Peacocks are a lekking species, which means all the males come to one location and jump around and attract the females. And when we talk about leks, which we will do soon, one of those males gets like 95% of the copulations. Those other males around him, some of them will be unsuccessful, some of them will be able to get a female as she comes in, when he's occupied, may be able to get a female to mate with them. But a lot of those males are not going to reproduce, but they are using resources and taking up space, essentially. It would be the same for a female. It's just that in the wild population, if a female is fertile, she's pretty much going to be impregnated by somebody. Okay, that was a little off topic, but okay. For contest competition, only a fraction suffer, right? Only the losers suffer. The winners get the pizza, the losers have to watch them eat it. The population is going to be more stable, and so it's going to be at carrying capacity, but kind of like when we talked about homeostasis, this is another example of homeostasis, essentially. Your set point and your range is going to be like this, right? It's not going to be an exact flat line, because your resources are going to become more abundant and less abundant, and so it's going to fluctuate. But what this is saying is, for scramble competition, it fluctuates like this, and for a contest competition, we're right at decay. It's just barely going to fluctuate decay. And then because you are giving all your resources to the winners, the strongest, they're going to have enough to survive, grow, and reproduce, and that's going to reduce your waste. The ones that aren't reproducing aren't going to be able to compete and get resources, essentially. It's a pretty harsh world out there. All right, any questions about that? I'm confused as to why this is our next slide, but okay. I don't feel like it's time for that. All right, one of the things associated with our population growth models is this idea of source populations and sink populations. And I mentioned these briefly as we talked about metapopulation models, specifically when we talked about the mainland island model, where the mainland acts as a source, and then the islands that are near the mainland, they act as sinks. But we want to expand upon that a little bit. The idea of sources and sinks is getting to add not only looking at birth rates and death rates, but also getting back to the idea that immigration and emigration may not always be in balance. So we're contributing to our models in that way. So just to get them all defined, at the top, your source is your good habitat, your optimal habitat. If you were of this particular species, this would be where you want to be. This is your mansion, for me, the cabin, with hundreds of acres around me, of optimal woodpecker habitat. But this is where you're going to be the most successful. It's the most desired. It's the optimal habitat. A sink, on the other hand, is marginal habitat to unsuitable habitat. And so to put this into our survive, grow, and reproduce, here you could survive, grow, and reproduce. Here, you're probably just going to be able to survive and grow, and reproduction is going to be low. Okay. But you see that in the next line. In your optimal habitat, you typically are going to be full. Everybody wants to be in that neighborhood. And so there's not going to be any houses available for sale. So it's going to be full. Over here at the sink, where it says population sizes vary, that depends on the severity of the sink. Like if you can barely survive, then the population is going to be low. But if you can survive and grow, then a sink can have a surprisingly large population, a misleadingly large population. Okay, so that's going to come into play in just a second. But that's what it means by population varies, because we're talking about marginal all the way to unsuitable. So if we go back to our bell-shaped curve, the source is basically where you had to survive, grow, reproduce, right? And then we had two sections next to it. We had the survive and grow section, and we had the survive section, and then of course the no individuals. So what this is saying is your source is to survive, grow, reproduce. and your sinks are those other two areas. All right. So moving down to the next one here, probably no surprise, I've already mentioned it, your birth rate's high, and over here your death rate's going to be higher. That doesn't mean that they don't have babies over there, but they're not going to have many. There's not enough resources for them to have very many. Over here, you get a lot of immigration, immigration. And specifically, it's going to be individuals that are not able to hold and sustain an area in the source. And so that's why it says young and old. So the young ones that aren't fully matured yet, they aren't competitive, don't know what they're doing, don't know how to hold a territory. And then the old that become too weak to protect and defend their territory. Whereas our sink is maintained by immigration, specifically from the source. So these individuals are who are being pushed over into the sink. And so sinks can have a large population, like I said before, and that can be extremely misleading if you just go out and you count how many animals are present. So if you just go do point counts and say, oh, wow, I saw lots of cardinals over here, and then I also saw lots of cardinals over here, superficially, to the untrained eye, it may seem like they're both good pieces of habitat. And so what you really need to do is to go in and learn more about the mortality and natality of the population. What else could you measure? You could probably also look at your age structure, right? And so if you have lots of young individuals and lots of old individuals, that's going to give you a hint. For the turtle project I told you about when we discussed pre-reproductive, post-reproductive, reproductive populations, I told you that in the ditches near the city that had higher access to turtle hunting, essentially, or collecting, it had a really old population because the younger individuals were being removed, right? And so that was telling you that you were creating an opening, that was creating a sink for a weird reason there. The sink was being created by people removing the young, essentially. So you can look at the age structure in the population. If you can figure out how to do immigration, that would be helpful. But at the very least, you need to look at your birth rates and death rates and see what's going on. So if you were given two pieces of property and you needed to choose one to protect an endangered species, then you need to do more than just go out and count the individuals. You need to know something about the demographics, the stuff that we're talking about right now, essentially. All right, any questions about sources and sinks? Other than why I put it right there. Must have made sense at the time. This is what I expected next. That's social behavior. Social behavior may limit populations. It can limit such a factors such as the number of individuals in the habitat. So one example of this would be territorial species. Right? So territorial species will cause a more even dispersion being set up because they want to defend their particular habitat and resources. It can limit who has access to food. We've already seen that with our pizza examples. So dominance may keep the subordinates from being able to get into a food supply. It could influence who's going to get to reproduce. So you know anything about sea lions? Sea lions have harems. And so you have a male that protects his harem, but during the time that he's protecting his harem, he doesn't get to eat or sleep or anything like that. And so over time, of course, he becomes very weak, and eventually another male will come in and push him out and take over his harem. But during the time period he's in charge of that harem, he's the one controlling who those females reproduce with, which would be him, right? So that's what that's talking about. And don't worry, what he does, I know the most about the Galapagos ones, but what they do is they'll go out to the ocean, they'll feed, sleep, regain their energy, and then they'll come back and they'll fight for their harem back. So it's not unusual for a male to hold a harem and then lose his harem and then come back and get a harem, that kind of thing. All right, social organization is based on a few things, such as aggressiveness, intolerance. I feel like that's what I have when I'm not at work. I mean, that's just you don't tolerate other individuals in your space, basically. That's what it's talking about. It can lead to aggressiveness if somebody gets into your space enough, right? Tests that enough that it can lead to aggressiveness. Dominance. So some type of hierarchy, social structure. Those are the types of things that are going to help you set up a social organization. But as you talk about social organization, there are really two opposing factors that you have to keep in mind. First, we actually do need each other. You need each other for mating. Sometimes you may need each other for protection, because for some species you're going to be safer in a group than if you are if you're by yourself. In some situations you're safer in a group than if you're by yourself. And so humans generally are a gregarious species, meaning that we like to hang out in groups. But we also need our own space, and you need your own time for your own mental health. And each person's a little bit different in how much space they need. So people who live in big cities like New York City, their whole space may be a single room. Anybody ever visited that area? I don't know. I haven't. When I was in grad school, I went up, and one of my friends, her sister lived in an apartment in New Jersey and then worked in Midtown Manhattan. And we went and stayed with her, and her whole apartment was a single room that was her bedroom and living room. And then it had just a little sliver of a bathroom, and then across from that, just a little sliver of a kitchen. And that was her whole entire space.
I've seen videos.
Yeah.
I saw this one chick, it was smaller than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
I
And
couldn't do it.
paid something like $1,100 back then a month, something like that. And that would have been, a long time ago since I was in grad school.
She paid about $1,000 a month.
Mm-hmm. Yo, and that wasn't in the city, so she commuted in, which we went with her. It was fun. It was a fun trip, but yeah, by the end of it, I needed space for sure. Right? I need a yard, at the very least. That kind of thing. So people's need for space kind of varies. But we need, even if it's just a small space like that, you need it. You need some type of space for yourself. Each individual of the group has a position based on dominance and submissiveness. And so one individual generally would be the dominant over all others, and that one is called the, say it? Is it on there already too? Alpha. So alpha is dominate over everybody. And then the beta is dominant over everybody but the alpha. And you keep going in line until eventually you get to the omega, which is subordinate to all of the individuals in their group. And so I'm guessing you've heard of those type of terms before. My first dog wanted to be an alpha, and so I don't know how familiar you are with dogs, but that caused issues. She would test my authority continuously. My current dog is a beta. It's so much nicer in a lot of ways. A little bit easier to deal with.
Is she like the boss of Scout and stuff?
Yeah, she's a beta. She doesn't want to go much further down the chain, but she doesn't seem to have any trouble being beta. But she doesn't have to be alpha. Scouts are omega. Oops, I didn't get it up there. There's the omega. And so how do we determine who's alpha? Well, you do things like bluff, threaten, and it could escalate to fighting. You're going to start with bluffing, and if that doesn't work, then you move to threatening. And if that doesn't work, as a last resort, you go to fighting. In other words, this is an ordered list. You don't jump to fighting. Why don't we jump to fighting?
Very energetic.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy. You also risk injury. Yeah. And most animals can't just run to the urgent care and get get stitches. And so generally fighting is going to be your last resort. And even then, a lot of times the fights are choreographed, right? They're ritualized. They're going to do a specific thing. So for example, I was out one day watching woodpeckers, red-bellied woodpeckers. And I noticed one of them started acting funny. It was like, and it started like bobbing up and down, and it was definitely agitated. In other words, it was starting with some bluffing. The other woodpecker that was trying to come into the territory, in this case it was for my masters, And the one that I noticed was behaving weirdly was marked. He had a tail tag. I don't remember his number now, say it was blue 1 or whatever, but I knew that individual. And I knew that was his territory. And the other individual came in, and then they started bobbing at each other, right? So that's kind of the threatening, and it's escalating at this point. And then eventually they flew up in the air and they grasped each other's feet. So they locked feet, and then they started pecking each other with their bill. Which for woodpeckers can be extremely dangerous. You don't want a woodpecker to peck on you. It hurts badly, right? They peck holes in the trees. That's what they do. But what I noticed is they were going opposite directions from each other. They never hit each other. And so even though it escalated to fighting, they were still doing a choreographed fight. And what they were trying, in the process, what they were trying to determine was each other's strength, right? In this case, they were both pretty stubborn. They fell all the way to the ground before they broke apart. But eventually the one that was the invader flew off, and the one that was marked stayed in that territory, so I guess he won. He was there from then on. Yep.
So with those like choreographed fights where they don't actually hit each other, how do you then determine who's stronger?
Okay, it's in the grasping, and you're testing each other. So another example, like more classic, if you pick up a textbook, they're gonna use bighorn sheep, right? And so the bighorn sheep come in and they butt heads against each other. And one of them's gonna come away like this, and the other one's gonna be like here. Right? That's basically the idea. Same thing with deer. They're gonna come in and it's all choreographed. They're not gonna actually hit each other with their antlers, right? They put their antlers together and they push and shove, right? It can continue to escalate. It can become violent, and you can see injuries for sure. But generally speaking, that's not in your best interest, right? Because if you do get injured, then your chances of surviving and reproducing go down, which is probably how it led to those types of behaviors to start with.
It's like a really gradual progress of testing. Do I really want to mess with this guy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for birds, it starts out with singing. This is my area, tweet, tweet, tweet. And in some species, the complexity of their song is a signal of their strength and fitness. So like mockingbirds, the more sounds they can mimic, the less likely they're going to be challenged. So it's a variety of different things. But the bottom line is fighting, last resort. Okay. Now that we've got our social organization, let's talk a little bit about home ranges and territories. So a home range is the space an animal normally uses during the day. They are not defended. By definition, a home range is not defended. However, in some species, the home range and the territory may be the same thing. Right? So a territory is defended, a home range is not. So when I was in grad school, I had a friend, I think I may have mentioned it this semester, but I don't know which class. He was working on feral cats. And so he'd catch feral cats and he would put collars on them and follow where they would go. And you would find that they would roam through overlapping areas, but they would tend to defend certain patches, right? That's what they would do. And so that always made me think about if you did that to one of us. So if you put a radio collar on me and you tracked me, you would find that I come here to work, go to Walmart, get groceries. I go to Crave a lot, hit the gym, and then I go back to home. So all of that would be part of my home range. It's where I tend to stay most of the time. However, only a piece of that is protected. Which part am I actually defending?
Your house.
My house, yeah. So even if you did it at the university, I came here for class, and then I'm going to go back to my office. And so this would be part of my home range, but I'm really only going to defend my office. And I wouldn't defend it that hard, but I do lock the door because there's confidential stuff in there. All right. And so the size of the home range varies with food availability, mobility, body size, and metabolic needs. And so food availability, I feel like that makes sense. It has to have food on your home range. That's part of being alive. Mobility, I think when we talked about the patchy metapopulation model, I gave the example of birds versus slugs, right? So the home range, the size of the home range of a slug is going to be smaller than the size of a home range of a bird, that kind of thing. Body size, kind of similar. The larger the animal, the more resources they tend to need, and the larger the territory size or home range size they need. And then metabolic needs is getting towards what would an ectotherm versus endotherm need, for example. So generally an ectotherm is going to need a smaller area than an endotherm of the same size because they don't need as many resources, that kind of thing. So that's where this list is coming from, and some of the considerations into what goes into the size of your home range. All right, any questions about that? And so what are some of the advantages of having a home range? One, you know where your resources are. So you know where your food is, you know where shelter is, you know where your escape cover is. You're generally more secure in your home range than you are if you leave your home range. So my dog loves to kill rabbits, loves it. And she's also very good at it. Sometimes, I usually try to keep her contained to the backyard because she can be kind of aggressive towards wildlife, not towards people. She loves people. But there was a buck in my yard today. Before I could get over there and get a good look at it, she was already barking at it. I was like, no. Anyway, she likes to kill rabbits. Every once in a while, I'll let her out of the fence and she'll chase a rabbit. And I think, oh, it's history, it's toast. And it'll jump into a bush, never to be found again, right? Because we're in its home range, it was feeding near an escape cover, and it knew exactly where it needed to go, so it wouldn't be caught by probably coyotes, because I have lots of coyotes around the house. Nala doesn't get off that often. Now sometimes though, because I do keep Nala in the backyard, I'll let her out in the evening, and a rabbit has made its way into the fenced backyard. What happens to that rabbit?
It did.
It depends. If it's close to where it came into the yard, which means that's a smarter rabbit, I guess, then it's closer to its escape route and it can get out. But if it's moved its way out into the yard and it's not close to escape route, yeah, it's history. It's toast. The next thing I know, I have screaming rabbit in the backyard. All right. But that's important factors to keep in mind. So once you're pushed out of your home range, you don't know where that escape cover is. So then you're left with outrunning the predator, or hoping that you can find something real quick, and you become a lot more vulnerable. All right. Any questions about home range? I really was really amazed one of the first times that happened in the yard, because the rabbit was like right there. Nala was at that spot in an instant, and I saw it jump like 3 times and then it disappeared, and Nala circled that bush for like an hour. Never picked up the scent, never found that rabbit. It's pretty amazing. All right, that leads us to territories. Territory now is a defended area. And so how do you defend your territory, given that you don't really want to fight? There's a list there. You can do singing and calling. You can mark with scents. You can do intimidation displays, attacking and chasing. Whoops, I don't go there yet, and so forth. I need to find this comic. I used to have a copy of it. I think it's Mother Goose is the name of the comic. And the dog had gone out into the forest behind the house, and it had put a Post-it note on every tree that said mine. And then the dog was coming back, and all you really see in the comic is you see the picture of the trees with mine. And then somebody asked him why he did that, and he's like, it's much more sanitary. So instead of peeing on all the trees, he just put Post-it notes. But marking is really common. Your dogs, of course, will mark. Deer have a special way that they can pee down the side of their leg and leave scents and stuff like that. So there's lots of different marking and scents that take place. Those of you who know, I've only had a cat for a year, and apparently they have scent stuff on their face, and they run and rub it on my face, and I hate it. That's one thing I do not like about Scout. She wants to put her face right here. So lots of different stuff. She wants to mark me, I guess. I don't know. We've already kind of talked about displays and chasing, so those are the same type of ideas. The next thing we're going to do is talk about types of territories. The first one is where their territory and their home range are essentially the same thing. So that's just a general purpose territory. And I suspect if you go out into the general population, that's what they're going to think of a territory being. And what we're going to try to do by looking at some of these types of territories is kind of expand how you think about it. And we already started with thinking about my own home range. I don't defend all of the area that I occupy, and so I don't have a general purpose territory. But a lot of animals do. So most of the songbirds, which is what a lot of people are familiar with, the songbirds in their backyard, they do have a general purpose territory, and so they're going to feed, breed, all of that stuff is going to happen inside their territory. And the cute little muskrat apparently also does that. Another type of territory are mating nesting territories, and this is where you only defend where you nest. The nest only, essentially. And so for this, I have the example of, this is a yellow-breasted chat. It has a pair of white eyeglasses on, one of the ways I know that it's a chat. And it's got a yellow breast, of course. It's fairly large, looks warbly, but pretty large. And at the top, you've got a picture of one of their nests. And this bird has a mating and nesting territory. And so in this picture, I've got an arrow. Did it come up? There's the arrow. There's the chat right there. And they nest in blackberry briars. And so somewhere in this clump of blackberry briars is that chat's nest. That was hard to say. And this is all they'll defend. That's it. Just that one bush. They'll all go feed together at the berry bush nearby. No problem. Don't get aggressive towards each other. But they will get aggressive if another one tries to get near their bush. Okay? So their home range is much broader than their territory. Only defending where they nest. This is common in hawks, lecking species, and colonial birds. So when we're working, we talked about the herons, the heron rookeries. And that you have to have one adult at your nest at all times, or your neighbor's just going to throw stuff out, right? But they do defend their nest. They will occupy it and try to keep their neighbors from doing that. All right. Next type is a food resource territory. This is where you defend your food source. Probably a classic example, if you open your textbook, is going to be the hummingbirds that get so aggressive around the hummingbird feeders. They'll defend that hummingbird feeder, right? But their actual nest or home range may be quite a distance from the feeder. In my picture, I always like to do something different. And so this is a red-headed woodpecker carrying some acorns. I got excited this weekend. I took a picture of a red-headed woodpecker, and I thought, when I first snapped it, I thought he had acorn. I was like, yeah, because this isn't my photo. But it wasn't. It was a bud of some sort. It wasn't an acorn. But anyway, what red-headed woodpeckers do in the fall is they will cache their acorns. And so they'll make little storage spots throughout the woods, and then they will come back and eat them throughout the winter. That's their winter food supply, essentially. And they will defend these caches. They will not defend their area per se. They don't have a big, area that they're defending, but they will defend their food source. This picture I did take. I took this picture at Big Cypress Tree. Apparently when everything was purple outside. I don't know, it must have been in the evening or something. But it's got a weird effect on there. And you can see that the woodpecker has wedged the acorns in here, but it hasn't completed this cache. When it completes the cache, what it'll do is it'll actually cover them up with strips of bark so you can't see them. So that's pretty cool. But I was actually able, usually these are high up in the trees, in the tops of the trees, so I was pretty happy to find one low enough that I could get a picture of. So only defend this, nothing else. In the winter, they have regular breeding territories in the summer, but in the winter, that's all they're going to defend. Winter roosting territories. And so this is where you defend the area where you sleep. That's what roost means. And this is, again, kind of a birdie thing. This is particularly important for species in which where they roost are scarce. And so if you know anything about woodpeckers, they have to have snags, either large dead branches or dead standing trees in which they can excavate their cavities. And often they are limited by the number of snags available in the area. That's a limiting factor for them. And so when they do have good snags and they have good cavities that they will be using, they will defend those cavities. That's theirs. Now, having said that, they get really wimpy when a starling comes to steal it, but whatever, that's a whole different story.
Will like a single individual like change its territories like throughout the year, like when it's like nesting or roosting?
It depends on the group, the species that you're dealing with. For red-bellied woodpeckers, during the summer, the male and female home range and territory are general purpose for the most part, and they completely overlap. In the winter, they stay loosely paired, and there's a little drift, like their home ranges don't overlap quite as much, probably partly because there's not as many resources and they need more area. If you're looking at something like chickadees and titmice, they're going to be somewhat territorial while they're breeding, but they're in flocks in the winter. So it just very much depends. I think overall, this part of the conversation is trying to get you to understand that territories are not just always set up and defended all the time and encompassing and everything. It's a lot more complicated than that. And that home range and territory are not equivalent. All right, the next couple of slides talk about why should you defend a territory, and it's going to end up with a graph. And I want to take some time on the graph, so let's stop and we'll talk about why defend a territory on Monday.